1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Yeah, Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour.
Welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour, the podcast where I talk to soulful individuals who made their mark in music in Muscle Shoals, Nashville, and beyond. Thanks for tuning in. My guest today is Russell Mefford. Russell Mefford is the leader of the Fiddleworms, one of the great bands coming out of North Alabama, and certainly one of my favorite bands. I had the honor of producing their latest album, the live album Perfect Storm, that we recorded at the Nut House a few years ago with Jimmy Nutt behind the board. And that's how I got to know Russell and his bandmates. Russell is also a third-generation jeweler who's running his family business, Mefford Jewelers in Florence, Alabama, where he's been developing many music-related pieces of jewelry and accessories that are just great. And I would like to urge anyone to check out Mefford Jewelers when you go down to Muscle Shoals. Russell has also been the mastermind of live shows, highlighting the connection of Muscle Shoals music and the Beatles last year, and this year's show celebrating the intersection of the Rolling Stones and Muscle Shoals music. It's my pleasure of having Russell as the guest of today's episode of the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. Welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour, Russell Mefford. Thank you so much for being my guest today.
Man, I'm glad to be here, Andreas. Thank you, man.
You're one of the most original voices, both as a singer and a songwriter here in this town. And to me, that says a lot because there's so much talent coming out of here. And it's just like every time I hear one of your songs, and we'll talk about some of these songs, I'm sure, it's just like, that's so cool. And that's right in our backyard here.
Well, I'm honored you dig it, man. Thank you. I'm happy to chase the bus. We've got a bus full of talent here, and a lot of it has come to the forefront because of you. So thank you, man.
Well, it's just a special place with the whole history and a lot of people connected to even kind of mythical things like the river, but whatever it is, there's just a wealth of music and talent coming out of here. Now, what interests me is like when you grew up and first caught the music bug, what were you exposed to musically, or what was like the world around you when you kind of first got exposed to music and started loving music?
I guess the first thing, I always loved music, but there was a song called Raindrops that, for whatever reason, I loved that song as a really small child, and I had a little bitty record player, and I would play that song over and over and over again to the point where it would turn up missing, for a couple days, I think, just to save my parents' sanity. And then, a little while later, I was a John Denver fan. That was one of the first shows I saw. I think the first show I ever saw was with my parents. We were up in Nashville at a jewelry show, and Ronnie Milsap performed. And I was blown away, man. He stood up on top of this piano and was just a real showman. And I found out years later that Marie Louie was part of that show as well, which was awesome.
Yeah, there's even more Muscle Shoals connection with one of his biggest hits.
No Getting Over Me, yeah.
That Walt Aldridge, here a local songwriter, wrote that and was a huge #1 hit in the early
song.
80s.
Great song, man. And then from there, I love Marvel Comics. growing up, and that's what I think was so ingenious about Kiss. You know, I was a huge Kiss fan. That kind of showed me a little bit of kind of the show business side of it. You know, they wore those platform shoes and the makeup. So they were like superheroes. And I had heard where they were kind of put off that there were all these 9 to 12-year-old kids showing up to their shows, you know, and I'm sure they would rather have had 19-year-old girls, which I'm sure they had plenty of those too, man. But there were a lot of us kids that loved Kiss. I mean, I even cleaned out my whole closet and had kind of a Kiss shrine with posters and collected the bubblegum cards. So kind of eclectic from the beginning, you know.
How old were you when you actually started making music rather than just loving music?
I actually didn't start playing guitar until I was 15. So I would, you know, write poems and sing things in my head, and I would sit in my room and bounce on my bed. In fact, it drove my parents crazy because I would wreck mattresses, just sit in the same place and bounce to these songs and envision what it would be like to be in a band, you know. In fact, kind of the set list for our cover band, Johnny Rotten Cash, a lot of the songs take me back to those days as a kid, sitting in the room listening to Give Me Some Truth by John Lennon, you know, or Destroyer by the Kinks. So
Yeah. And then, was it not too long after that where you, and I might not have to complete the right, and you can tell me, went to a type of camp and got introduced to somebody that's shaped your musical, like, evolution quite a bit?
I did. It was I had gone to a camp in Alabama, and I had you know, they had really young. The counselors there were not much older than we were, and I just picked the wrong day to short sheet a counselor's bed, you know, and so the counselor had lost some kind of volleyball game or something they were doing, and he came back and he really beat me up pretty bad, and ripped the sheets off my bed and stuff. So I had mailed a letter, you know, because there weren't any, you weren't able to call or anything like that. So I mailed a letter to my mom just saying, hey, could you send me some sheets? And that concerned them. So they called the camp, and so after that, it was a pretty rough time, and so they wanted me to have a good experience in that type of environment, and really probably to keep me out of trouble during the summertime. So my sister is a whitewater paddler, and she was a guide on the Nantahala and the Ocoee, and they asked her about it, and she was really impressed with the paddlers that were coming out of a camp called Mondamon, which is right outside of Hendersonville. In fact, a lot of their paddling staff like paddles for the Olympics, you know. So they sent me up there to learn how to kayak, paddle whitewater. And on the way to the camp, Jan Brand, who ran they called it Taj, after Taj Mahal. It was like the center where you went and got your mail and stuff. She asked me what I was into, and I just started playing guitar, and I was like, man, I love music. And she said, well, there's a guy on the maintenance staff named Waz. And it turned out that Waz was going through a divorce, and as you know, as musicians, like, we can tell you what's going on for the next 2 or 3 months, but not after that. And so they were going to try to make him pay for the fact that he didn't have a steady gig. So he or a long term, he couldn't tell them 6 months out what his work schedule was like. So he got a job at for the maintenance staff at the camp under the name William Zeal, which is his name, but nobody knows him as William Zeal. So word got out. He played guitar, I guess, in front of a couple of the maintenance guys, and word got out who he was. And so Jan Brand was like, yeah, this guy, you know, he played with Jimi Hendrix and B.B. King. So I ended up never getting in a boat, you know. The second day I was there, I was coming back from my swim test. I had my bathing suit on, I'm dripping wet, there's a guy, I just looked at him, I was like, that's got to be Waz, and he was emptying a trash can into a dumpster, and I said, are you Waz? And he said, yeah. And I said, have you ever made a record? And he said, yeah, actually, I've made 2 records so far. And I said, man, that's crazy cool. It'd be crazy cool to make a record. And he said, well, okay, man, one day we'll make one. First time I met him. And so he really pushed me. We would do morning assemblies at the camp, and he would, the day before, we would go over what we were going to do the next day, and most of the time I wasn't prepared, but he'd be like, too bad you're doing that tomorrow morning. So I would work and work and work all day and into the night to be prepared for morning assembly the next day, and that really helped me out. And he would tell me things because I told him, I don't know how to read music. And he said, there were people writing music before and playing music before there were people writing down how to play music. So he always lifted me up. And so that's, the second year I came back to that camp, we recorded a song over in Greenville, South Carolina, called Bullet's Tune. That was one of the first songs that I had written. And then from then on, my plan was when I got out of college, while I was in college, Waz would stay with me when he was touring, and we ended up, I wrote a song called Attitude and another song called Easy Girl, and Waz thought they were good songs. And that was the first one, Attitude was the first song my dad really liked. And that's another reason I respect my dad so much, is he didn't sugarcoat anything. I probably played 100 songs to him before I had written Attitude, And he said, that one's not bad, So Waz suggested that he thought they were worth recording, and he reached out to Johnny Sandlin, and we booked some time over in Decatur at Duct Tape. And that's where I first met Scott Boyer. I guess I was 19 years old, and also met B.W. Wheeler, and Jeff and Susan Sauls were part of the Decoys at that time. And B.W. was the drummer. Johnny was playing bass, and they were wonderful.
So hold that thought real quick. Was that session in South Carolina, was that your first time in a recording studio?
Yes. Yes,
and I believe you cut 2 songs over there.
I did.
And there was a 45 of some sort that you pressed up.
We did. In fact, I've still got a couple boxes of them, man. But and we took a picture out on Ghost Bridge, which was kind of a mythical place here in town. And the A-side was Bullet's Tune, and then the B-side was called Mind Over Money, I think is what that song was called. But it was the first time in the studio, and I was scared to death, but again, so much of the studio is who you're with and the room, and it was a comfortable place, and of course Waz made it good, made me feel comfortable and a lot easier to climb inside the song when you're in that kind of environment.
Talking about Waz, and you mentioned his 2 albums, but would you mind telling a little bit more about kind of what kind of guy he was and what kind of his musical history up to that point was?
Yeah, Waz is from Tampa, Florida, and he is a blues player. Now I think it's pretty typical for people to play, do loops and that sort of thing, but he was kind of a grassroots version of that. He would play tambourine with his foot and blow harmonica and play dobro, or he had an Epiphone electric that he plays, and great slide player using different tunings. When I first met him, he was touring with John Hammond, but before that, he was in a band, and they were signed to some kind of publishing deal where they were pitching songs, and they were supposed to cut Abraham, Martin, and John was the song. And Waz was really excited about it, and he said he had done a cool harp part to it, and they ended up giving that song to, I think Dion ended up recording that song. And so the next song that they pitched to him was Me and You and a Dog Named Blue. Is that what it is? Boo or Blue, anyway. And Waz said the only way he would do that song is if he could wear a paper bag over his head in the studio. So he's just one of those guys that, when I got out of college, I drove down to Tampa. I wanted to start a band with Waz. And we did a recording project down there that really was the only way that I ever became a Fiddleworm. Without that project, that never would have happened. He's kind of got like he called me and said, hey, I'm playing a show in Mobile, and drove down there and went to dinner, and it was with Leo Kottke, and we had dinner with him, and he opened for Leo Kottke, and so Waz was definitely respected in the industry, and just a kind, beautiful, talented human being.
I believe he also made an album with Roy Bookbinder, who was
He produced
kind
it.
of a folkier version of John Hammond, if you will.
Yeah, the Roy Bookbinder and the Hillbilly Blues Devils or something like that, man. But yeah, he produced a record on Roy Bookbinder. And of course, he was telling me that Hendrix was real nice when he came to town, that he would have local blues acts open for him. So he opened for Hendrix twice. Played with B.B. King, and he's still out there doing it, man. He's down in Tampa, and I don't talk to him as much as I'd like to, but that's the great thing about Facebook these days, is we can kind of touch base and see where each other is at.
And you took him up here to Handyfest at least once, right?
Yeah, Nancy Gauntz brought him. He and a young lady named Sandy had a duo, and I think they kind of stole the show the first time they came up here, and they were also a love interest, and when that split up, they went their separate ways. But he's played Handy Festival, at least 3 times, if not 3 or 4 times. And but I owe a whole lot to Waz. And in college, he came and stayed for 2 months, because when we cut Attitude and Easy Girl, Johnny expressed some interest in me, and so Waz was like, "You got to keep writing." So he didn't go back home to Tampa. It drove my roommate a little crazy, but we just wrote, and that's when Waz came up with Tension, which ended up being on the Yellowhammer record. But and a lot of the songs, he would help me with. He would help, like, you need to work on that part. You need to, so I would definitely consider him not only a friend but a mentor.
Yeah. So, what happened after this Johnny Sandlin project? Waz was part of that too. He played on it, right?
Yeah, he put the musicians together. I mean, I had David Kaminsky, who is an ER doctor up in the Carolinas. I met him at the camp, and he's a great bass player, and so he played bass on that track. John Bloomer played drums on that track. John's plays with Will and Kelvin and those guys, and is an incredible, talented musician here in the Shoals. I always said he could play like Stuart Copeland and sing like Sting, But and then Waz played guitar, and after we cut those, my dad, kind of realizing that this was not just a whim, and that I was serious about it, was able to get Sam Phillips' address over in Memphis. So I mailed him a cassette tape, and came home from class one day, and there was a message on my machine, and it said, "Hey, this is Sam Phillips. Will you give me a call?" And I danced all around my dorm room and called him up, and he said that I had a very unusual writing style. And of course I was like, "Well, I'll move to Memphis right now, Mr. Phillips." And he was like, "Man, you need to keep writing. I've retired, but I'm going to pass these songs along to my sons, and you may hear from them, you may not, but don't stop what you're doing. And for a 19-year-old kid, that shows what kind of man he was. I mean, to take the time to do that was, talk about building your confidence, you know. So, and about a week or two later, Jerry Phillips called, and they tried to pitch those songs for me. And I think at one point Eddie Rabbit had a hold on Easy Girl. We never had anything cut, but that was a real shot in the arm for me to keep moving forward, you know.
And somebody else got to hear your music too. Was that around the same time?
Who would that be, man?
Jerry Wexler.
No, that was later, actually, man. That was later. Jerry Wexler. You know, the funny thing was, my brother put up with me for a long time because, music did interfere with 9-to-5 kind of jobs. When Chris and I were together and we were playing 6 days a week, and, I was not on time. But my brother is really one of the big reasons that I got into music. I mean, he has a record collection that's probably worth more than everything in our jewelry store, man. And so, being 15 years older than me, he was the one who introduced me to the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and Bob Dylan and the Allman Brothers. I mean, just the list as long as the day. And so, when Chris passed away and we decided to go ahead and release the Yellowhammer record, there was a real outpouring for the community to try to get that out there and to get Chris out there for people to know who he was. And so Ronnie Knight called and gave me Jerry Wexler's address, and I mailed him a copy of Yellowhammer. And I was coming back from lunch at the store, and it was just perfect timing, man. I walked through the door, and the phone's ringing, and my brother answers the phone, says, Mefford Jewelers, and I could see the look on his face, He said, hold on just a minute, and he put the person on hold, and he put the phone down, and he said, Russell, Jerry Wexler's on line 1 for you. And he was so awesome. I mean, he gave me his Florida address and his New York address and told me he wanted me to mail a copy of the record to Phil Walden at Capricorn. No, that's not true. That's not true. He told me to mail him a couple copies of the record. That he had a couple people that he said he had somebody at Atlantic he wanted to mail it to and somebody at Capricorn he wanted to mail it to. And so about 2 weeks later, Phil Walden called, and I explained the situation. It was a very strange and trying time for everybody involved, in that we had this record that we put out, and the spiritual force behind that record was no longer with us, and then we had this other incredibly talented guitar player, Rob Malone, who just we were playing as a 3-piece without a guitar player. Just, we didn't know what to do. We had all these gigs, just played, and Rob just showed up and said, I'll do it. And Rob was just as close to Chris as we all were. And so it was difficult for all of us to play those songs, but I can't imagine for him, because he made the decision that he was not going to play those songs the way Chris would play them. He thought that would be an insult to Chris. It was so fresh, and it was so raw that we had just lost him, that he decided, I'm going to play these songs the way I would play them. And it was totally different. And people pushed back against that. But it was the most beautiful thing he could have done for us. It really allowed us to heal. And, I always said, music was always my escape, where I could go when things were bad. And when that happened, when we lost Chris, it was like, I felt like somebody was standing on my chest. It was like it was such a burden and a labor to sing these songs and to go and play. And through Rob doing what he did, he helped us heal. And then to the point to where, when Mitch Mann came in, who is more in the vein of how Chris would play. It turned into a celebration of who Chris was and what these songs are. So I guess we've always stumbled through the dark, and that's always worked the best for us. Anything that I've ever tried to plan or map out has usually failed miserably.
But after you recorded that album and then Chris passed, you put the Fiddleworms on hold for a while, right?
Well, we continued on because we had the night, there was a big street party, May the 26th, 1996. We played, and there was supposed to be record labels coming out, and they had called before the show. We had, city stages, we had shows, we had all these shows for the summer and in the fall booked. And we had given these guys a list of these shows. And so they were like, well, we're going to catch you at, we're going to catch you one of these shows. And so that night after, Chris passed away early, the show was actually on the 25th and Chris passed away early on the 26th. We took one weekend off and then decided we would go ahead and play. So we played all those shows. Rob came in, and Rob was with us for about a year, I guess. And and then he, like I said, I can't imagine the burden it was for him to do what he did. And he came in, he was like, man, I can't do this right now, And so he moved to Athens, and Mitch came in and played guitar. And around that time, my mom got very sick, and I felt like I needed to be home. And so we shelved the Fiddleworms project. And all of us kept playing. Matt and Scott moved to Huntsville and met Mike Roberts and formed 5 O'Clock Charlie, and Mitch and I continued playing acoustic. And so I guess for about 8 years we were dormant.
You also had a band called Kenny and the C-Notes for a while, right?
Yes, we did. Yeah, that was before the Worms got back together. That was I got to meet David McKay, man. He's from San Francisco and married Donna Jean Thatcher, who's from Sheffield. And Donna and David had moved back to Florence in the 80s, but I didn't meet them until, early 2000, I guess, maybe, man. So David started sitting in with us. It was me and Mitch and a drummer named Tom Risher. Tom was a fabulous drummer, wrote the drum lines at the University of North Alabama for forever, and through that we ended up forming Kenny and the C-Notes with this guy,
Kelvin Holly.
Hey, man, and
His ears must have been burning.
That's right. You say C-Notes and they will come. That's what we hope.
Yeah.
But no, I think the name of the band is why Kelvin and Donna wanted to be in the band. We had a kind of a local character named Kenny Neese, who his family owns real estate, and they were leasing or renting a place to a guy out on the river, and he had abandoned his house, and Kenny went out to clean out the house and put on a jacket and stuck his hand inside the jacket and pulled out 36 $100 bills. And he is one of the nicest, most giving people you'll ever meet. I mean, if he has money, he's going to give it to you. And there are times I'll be like, Kenny, don't put that 100 bill in my tip jar, because he needs it too, but he's going to give it to you, or he's going to give you his jacket off his back. So he went out with this money and paid all his tabs and bought people drinks and dinner. And he'll come into a bar and go, set them up, and buy people shots. So when all these places went to make their deposits on Monday, it turned out it was counterfeit. So anyway, I thought, what a great name for a band, Kenny and the C Notes. So we played a couple shows and sold out what was then called the Keynote Room, and Gary Baker recorded that show. Is his called Cell Block? What is his Sound Cell? What is his studio called?
Noise Block.
Noise Block. And they had a snake running from his studio into that. Heath Colcock was the one who owned that venue at that time, and they were kind enough to record us, and then Russ Randolph from Boombox mixed that for us.
The next Fiddleworms album was Year of the Cock, and was that already recorded by that point?
No, we had gone up to Steve Backus, who's an attorney from Tuscumbia, had heard us play, and he bought us that 1974 Buick LeSabre orange limousine we used to ride around in, and a PA system, and paid to have us, like he would pay for our meals and our hotel room. I mean, he really helped us out. And he had suggested that Rodney Good and Mitch Shedd, they had a studio up in Nashville called Revolution, and he talked them into coming down to hear us play at a place called The Corner over in Huntsville. And they dug it, so they had us come up to Nashville to record.
So, and then eventually that came out and became the second Fiddleworms album.
Oh, no, that was Yellowhammer. And so after, actually Rodney and Mitch and those guys opened the show the night that Chris passed away, a band they were calling the Ethiopians, and both of us were trying to get a record deal, you know. So, and Rodney and Mitch's dad's a guy called Harold Shedd, who was a guy up in Nashville, and they were in Russ Zavitson, and those guys were kind of orchestrating all that. And so they were actually asleep at Scott and Matt's when all that went down. And so Rodney called me 2 months later, and he's like, y'all want to come up and just cut something, you know? So we went up and we cut 3 or 4 songs with Rob on guitar, and Chalmers was still playing keys. And then after we disbanded, I mean, I'd actually forgotten about it. And during the Kenny and the C Notes time, Mitch called me because Rodney ended up marrying a country artist named Jamie O'Neill, and James LeBlanc was playing guitar for them. And James ended up leaving, and Mitch had heard about it and asked if I would call Rodney to see if they were looking for a guitar player, and if so, if I might put in a word for him. So when I called Rodney, he was like, man, we're doing a duo thing, me and Jamie right now. I'm not sure what we're going to do, but I've got these songs. Do you want to come up and finish that record? So that's when I called Rob and all the fellas, and Mitch came, and Mike Roberts, and Chalmers came from Mississippi, and Chris's dad Carol came up and played mandolin and sang backgrounds on the song, and we finished that record. I didn't know what we were going to call it, so I was over at a Chinese restaurant here in town. It's called the Peking, and they had this menu where it had the Chinese zodiac signs on it, you know, and I was like, oh, well, I'm the monkey, you know, and looking around. I was like, well, I wonder what Chris is, and I looked, and it said he was the cock, and so I was like, perfect, you know. I was like, we'll call the record Year of the Cock. And it took forever to get that record mixed. And I was so disappointed that I wanted it to come out in 2002, or I can't remember when. Anyway, it came out a year after I thought it was going to, but it turned out the year it came out was actually the Year of the Cock, which, so things happen the way they're supposed to, you know.
Yeah, and then after that you did a live record called Live Bait, and then after that one called Volkswagen Catfish, where Calvin Holly has a guest spot on what is maybe my favorite Fiddleworms song, which is called The Noble Lie.
Kelvin not only played lead on that song, but he also lent us instruments. And
I'm here to help.
Yeah, the first time, I mean, I would go over and listen to Scott and Kelvin play. They played a lot over at the filling station as a duo. And, you know, Chris and I, we'd go over there and listen to try to learn, you know. And then, of course, Tuesday nights at Union Station were you know, and it may sound cliche, but it really was like going to church. You know, you would go over there and listen to those guys play, and you knew you had a lot of work to do. You know, so.
And you mentioned Scott Boyer earlier, too, who was in the Decoys with Kelvin.
Yes.
And you ended up writing a few songs with him, too. You had, my favorite one is called Don't Shoot the Prophet.
Right on.
But then there's also one you wrote with him and Donnie Fritts called I Need a Change. And then you revived that songwriter partnership right before he passed to write a few more.
We did. It was like he was on fire, man. I mean, you were part of that too. I know you and Mitch went over and wrote with him. That, by the way, that Stop Subtracting song is that the last song y'all wrote with him?
Yes, Mitch and I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That song is awesome. I mean,
he was on fire that day too. Just sit there in his chair, just kind of spitting out the lyrics, you know, and it's like, that's pretty good.
Life itself is hard enough.
Yeah.
Some beautiful lyrics, and but in typical Scott, man, like I was so excited. I was at Dick Cooper's, and he was like, "Hey, man, you and I ought to write a song together," because I never would have asked, you know. I mean, that's Scott Boyer, you know, man. So I was crazy excited about it. And after we wrote the song, I went over to his house. He was living, I thought he was still in the A-frame, but he wasn't. He was still off of Brush Creek Road over there, but it was that smaller house over. And we went over there and wrote together, and shortly thereafter we were hanging out, and I was like, man, you know, thank you so much for asking me to write with you, man. And that means so much to me. And he's like, well, you're only 5 miles down the road, you know what? so he's like, I figure what the heck, you know. So I got to write with him by proximity, I guess, man. But he asked me to write again, and he brought Donnie along, and we had breakfast at the Killin' Diner, and that's a Donnie Fritts song. I mean, you can listen to it. Donnie sat down at the keyboard, and he had, you know, woke up to the same old sunrise, and had the verse and the chorus, and Scott and I just a couple chord change suggestions and lyrics here and there,
and that ended up on the See the Light album, which, if the Fiddleworms ever made a concept album, that's the concept album, because it's like it takes you on a trip, and it has, like, you know, the whole horn players on it, and it's really probably your most eclectic record, I would think.
Yeah, we had a lot of help on that one, man. And I had something in my head. So many, you know, with the downloading things now, everybody just listens to songs. So I was like, I wanted for us to try to put something together with the idea that you would sit and listen to it in its entirety, you know. So, and through Jimmy Nutt, he turned me on to what's called a Zoom unit, which was a digital recording piece of equipment that you can carry around with you. So I literally walked around with that Zoom unit for a year and a half, recording buses passing down, cicadas, everything, as much as I could capture from the shoals as far as natural sounds. In fact, the origin of that idea was from Jimmy Nutt. He had the idea of us recording the river, recording cicadas, different natural sounds from this area, and then asking people like Spooner or Kelvin or Donnie to come in and listen to that and play what that sounded like to them. And we were going to call it Nature of the Muse was the idea, which we haven't done yet, but so from that I started recording all these sounds. And then again, Jimmy Nutt is so great that Rob and I wrote a song called Vicksburg, and we wanted to kind of tip the cap to Johnny Cash and the Sun Record guys, you know, like this, your typical, this guy loves the girl, she hooks up with the loser, a guy kills the loser, and then, you know, guy goes to prison. And at the end of the song, I heard like a band marching down the street playing in a parade. So I called Lloyd Jones, who's the band director at the University of Alabama, University of North Alabama, and asked him if he would like to, if they might want to be involved in it. There'd be a way to kind of merge what's going on at the university with professional recording of music. And the trick was to figure out how, the band is so big, it's over 200 people, so Jimmy didn't have 200 sets of headphones, so Jimmy came up with the idea of, I guess kind of a la Tusk, to go out to Brawley Stadium, and he set up a mobile unit, and Will Corey helped with that. And basically anybody who had a quality mobile recording device, we set them up all around the stadium and recorded the band playing at the end of that song. So
yeah, that's awesome. And that's around the time I met you guys, and I fell in love with the band. And me not really, at that point I didn't know about all of the history. I just, what was happening there in the present with that band, with Mitch and Rob both playing lead guitar, I was just like, this is awesome. And one day I guess I just, hey, hope you really need if you guys had a live record like this. And we actually ended up making this record at the Nut House with Jimmy Nutt.
it was great, man. Yeah, you actually, that was when when I first heard of you, you were taking the All-Stars over to Italy. And I just thought, how great is that? We were talking about how with Scott Campbell, how the artwork that he provides for this area now, with all the posters that he does and the album art that he just did, the Small Town Big Sound art. He's done art for us. He's done art for James LeBlanc. He did art for the new Billy Ray Cyrus record. Anyway, to my knowledge, we've never had that, and now we do. And we also never had a promoter for somebody to go out and scream to the world that Muscle Shoals is a cool place. So the renaissance of Muscle Shoals, I know you're a humble man, but a lot of it falls in your lap with taking the music out there. You took it to Italy, and then you were about to take the guys up to the Lincoln Center in New York, and you had asked if I would sell tickets out of my store. We had met, and I offered to do it. I can't remember how it went down, but I was like, sure, because you did kind of a warm-up show at the Marriott before y'all went up there, and he said, hey, well, where are y'all playing anytime soon? I was like, yeah, we're playing at the Chicken Shack over at Champy's, and you and Rachel came out to hear us, and then you offered to produce a record on us. And so we had never had anybody produce a record on us. It was always, it takes us 3 years or so to make a record. 'Cause if you've never made one, it's maybe hard to wrap your brain around, but it's really hard to make a record.
It is.
And anybody who's done one, man, you should feel great, because it's not an easy thing to do. Anything from writing to recording to the artwork to, it's all, and it's your baby, so you carry it with you everywhere,
Yeah. We recorded 2 nights at the Nut House, and all of your biggest fans pretty much were there, and your dad turned 91 that night of the show, and he sat in the front row there, and it was just like, it kind of, with me not really knowing the whole history as much as you do, obviously, maybe I shouldn't say it kind of felt like full circle, but it kind of, from my perspective, it certainly did, and that's why we ended up, and I think that was your idea.
No.
Calling it Perfect Storm.
Yeah, that was my idea. But the thing with my dad was you. That was I was like, man, my dad's coming, and he's turning 91 today, and you're like, we got to get him a cake.
Yeah, and you guys ended up playing the Beatles' birthday song.
Right on.
Which I thought was cool. And
but
you could tell how, proud he was. It was just like such a cool moment.
It was perfect, man.
So while we were talking about your dad, and you mentioned earlier how important he was, to you, and is, but there's like a second love in your life that actually is a family tradition, going back to your grandparents that opened a jewelry store here in Florence, and you've been running that store for the past 5 or 6 years.
Well, we just passed our 4-year anniversary in November, but My grandfather actually went to work in a jewelry store on Court Street in Florence in 1911. When he was just a kid. He was 11 years old, and he was running errands and that sort of thing for Mr. Brown. It was A. Brown and Sons Jewelers. And Mr. Brown was kind enough to teach my grandfather how to do jewelry repair. So that's how we got started. And he worked for Mr. Brown. At some point, Mr. Brown retired, and a gentleman named J.W. Summers opened a store on Court Street, and he worked for Mr. Summers. And then when he came back from World War II, he and my grandmother, Julia, opened the first Mefford Jewelers street over on Seminary Street in 1945. And my dad, who's 94 now, always kids that we worked our way back around to Court Street. So we're back on Court Street, and the store closed in December of 2013, and the reason that I'm here is because of this area and this community. I mean, there were people who actually bought the building and called me and said, we bought this building because we want to put you in it. I mean, it's been crazy how, what a giving community we have. So I'd never run my own store before, so it's been neat to be able to put music in the store. I wanted to put as much of this area of music in the store as people were willing, and I mean, we did the Muscle Shoals watches, which, I mean, how cool is it to have a David Hood watch in your store and a Sam Phillips watch? And that's a partnership with those families: Jimmy Johnson, Roger Hawkins, Barry Beckett, Donna Jean Godchaux, Rick Hall. They all came in with me and as a partnership for these watches, and it's the only place on earth that you can get them. So I'm extremely proud to carry them, and those are, I want to do watches on everybody. It's just, it's very expensive to get something like that off the ground. So I was trying to think of something I could do that I could have more control over. So I came up with these sterling silver keychains, and we're able to have people come in and sign, and I can take their actual signature, and we put that on one side of it's in the shape of a guitar pick, and put their signature on one side, and on the back side of it there's a Muscle Shoals logo that artist Evans Wall, who works with us, created. And we have an Andreas Werner guitar pick. We've got a Pete Carr. Mitch
more
Man.
importantly, like Pete Carr,
Hey,
Jimmy John.
You guys are all important, man. And it was really neat. Jimbo Hart from the 400 unit came in last week or the week before, and signed on, and he posted about it. And so actually today, right before I came over here, I mailed a Jimbo Hart and a David Hood pick over to the UK. So that's the first one's going out of the country.
That's great. And we talked about full circle before. To me, that's full circle too, because you get to combine these two, main things of your life and turn it into one. And it's really the coolest, Muscle Shoals swag is not the right word, but like art, jewelry, memento for anyone to have, because it's like, first of all, it's unique and it's authentic, and it's just like something you just can't get anywhere else.
Yeah, and everybody has stuff, so to me, if it has a story behind it, man, and so yeah, it's an honor to carry that stuff in the store, man.
We're almost at the end here, but early this year, you put together a Muscle Shoals meets the Beatles show, which was this big concert with the Fiddleworms, but also the Decoys and a lot of other guest artists performing Beatles songs that have, some sort of a connection with Muscle Shoals. And that was just kind of, one of the great musical highlights of this past year for me and for anybody here in town. And now you're working on and I'm not even going to say anything because I want you to.
Oh,
to
we're
announce
excited.
it.
We're going to do February 23rd. We're going to do Muscle Shoals meets the Rolling Stones. So, the Beatles thing again happened. Just I couldn't have planned it. I had two charities approach me about 3 years ago wanting the Fiddleworms to play a benefit, and I told them, my guys are, me and Johnny are really the only ones that have a steady day gig. The rest of the guys, they're full-time musicians, and I got to pay those guys, and I don't want to take money out of the charity's pocket. And it has to be an event. It can't just be us at a bar somewhere. So I always thought it was cool that the Beatles introduced me to my own music. That the first time that I heard Arthur Alexander, it was John Lennon singing it. First time I heard Carl Perkins songs, it was George Harrison singing them. And so anyway, they taught me about my home, and I thought that was a neat concept. And then you've got such killer players here. You got Charles Rose and Harvey Thompson and the horns who played with John Lennon at Madison Square Garden. You got Kelvin Holly and David Hood. I mean, Kelvin played on a session with Klaus Voormann. David was on that session too, and of course David played on the Aretha Franklin version of Let It Be. He didn't play the track, but he was on the session for the Hey Jude. He was telling me they had multiples that day for, and then so anyway, I was drinking at a bar, and a guy who owns a car business came up and said he had cover bands wanting him to sponsor a show, and did I have an idea for a show? And I was like, that was like 2 years prior, these people had approached me about doing this concert, and I could never figure out financially how to do it. And I was like, yeah, man. I said, if you don't mind me asking, how much are they asking for? And he's like, well, they're asking for $3,500 from me and $3,500 from CB&S Bank. I was like, man, I think I could put on a pretty cool show, man, for that. And so I called all the guys, and they were willing to be a part of it, and we were able to pay the musicians, pay Scott Campbell to do the artwork, pay Corey Hanna to make the video, pay Russ Randolph to mix the sound, pay to have extra sound brought in. And it made the charities a little nervous, because they were like, hey, once we had this sponsorship money, and they were like, what are you going to do with it? And I was like, well, I'm going to pay everybody. And they were nervous. And once they explained it to me, I was nervous too. I insisted that that's the way we should do it. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't lay in bed at night thinking, gosh, if this show only raises $1,000, and I've spent all that. But that's not what happened. And we were able to give each charity $11,000. And so we're going to do it again this February, man.
Yeah. Well, we're at the end of this podcast. Thank you so much for spending this past hour with me. And I wish you just the best of luck with the Muscle Shoals Meets the Rolling Stones show. I'm sure it's going to be a blast and as much over the top great as the last one was.
Can I ask one more thing, man?
Absolutely.
I had people come in, they said they thought the most original part of the show last year was when you and Donnie Fritts came out and did Come Together. Was that your idea?
No, it was not my idea. When you asked Donnie, and I was like sitting with him, and he said, I don't even know that many Beatles songs, but there's only this one that I think I might be able to do. And he didn't know what it was called. He was something like, he come up, look, that's Come Together. I mean, he had it. And then I'm like, yeah, this is perfect.
Yeah.
I mean, it was perfect. And the funny thing too is, not just on that show, ever since, he gets asked to do this song because everybody remembers him doing that song.
Yeah, it was great.
And it's funny, we kind of obviously, just making fun, but we introduced it as, and now Donnie's gonna sing a song that John Lennon wrote for him.
It sounds like it, absolutely.
So it was his idea, absolutely. And then he pulled it off, backed by your band. So
well, yeah, we had, I think Jimmy Nutt was playing drums on that, and you had a percussion thing that you had gotten from Mickey, right?
Yeah, I didn't have one, so I had to.
What was that, man?
A little slap.
Yeah, it's
slap
cool.
thing.
It was awesome.
So.
Well, Andreas, thank you, man.
Thank you. And I'm sure there's going to be many great musical memories to be made in the future.
Right on.
This was the 44th episode of the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. We recorded it at the Florence-Lauderdale Tourism Visitor Center in Florence, Alabama. If you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to check out some of our other episodes and subscribe to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour on iTunes or check it out on SoundCloud, YouTube, TuneIn, or Stitcher. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. Until next week.